Welcome back to Week 8 matchups that matter. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down all of the relevant fantasy football news, information, Vegas totals, top 5 matchups by position that you need to set your fantasy football lineups this week. So without further ado, let's get right into it. All right, let's kick things off with the top 5 over-under games on the Week 8 fantasy football slate. Again, when we are looking at these types of game environments, we want to be using these as tiebreakers in our fantasy football decisions. If we have, wide receiver 3 type in a low-scoring game versus wide receiver 3 type in a high-scoring game, maybe we want to use that as a tiebreaker and lean towards the guy in the higher-scoring game. So top 5 over-unders on the week, we can see the Miami Dolphins versus the New England Patriots, Los Angeles Chargers versus the Chicago Bears, Detroit Lions versus the Las Vegas Raiders, Dallas Cowboys versus the Los Angeles Rams, and then Denver Broncos versus the Kansas City Chiefs. So if you guys have a lot of players in these games, keep in mind these are expected to be some of the highest scoring on the slate. A little bit of a lower scoring slate this week. No games over, 47, 48, 49, 50 kind of range. Looks like a lot of these games are going to kind of blend together when it comes to some of these peripherals. So keep that in mind when it comes to your fantasy football decisions. Some of the lowest over-under games of the week, not expecting a lot of fireworks, are the Sharps in the Tennessee Titans, Atlanta Falcons game, and New York Giants, Jets game. Then we also have the Seahawks, Browns, Green Bay Packers, and Vikings, and then Steelers and Jaguars. All of those games are under 42 points or 42 points or less, and then especially those that Titans, Falcons, Giants, Jets, and then Seahawks, Browns game not looking to be very appetizing from a fantasy football standpoint. Then we get into the implied point totals. So within the over-unders, of course, certain teams are going to be favored, certain teams are going to be underdogs. The Vegas implied point totals is something that you definitely want to use and incorporate into your start-sit decisions, because when a team is implied for a lot of points, it's usually a good idea to go with that player in your fantasy football lineup. So, of course, the Miami Dolphins, Detroit Lions, and Buffalo Bills and Baltimore Ravens, some of the teams implied for the most points this week. We expect these offenses to probably be putting up points on any given week, but especially in these games, we see 26 or more points for all of those teams. The Los Angeles Chargers is one that I really want to direct your attention to because they have been a little bit of an up-and-down offense, but it should be a bounce-back spot here for them against the Chicago Bears. Then we get into some of the lowest implied point totals on the week. So these are games and teams you really don't want to be relying on fantasy players for, but of course you start your studs always. Atlanta Falcons, New York Giants, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Seattle Seahawks, and Arizona Cardinals. If you don't need to start a player from these teams, I probably would not. And again, of course you're going to start Bijan Robinson, you're going to start Drake London and Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall and all of your studs, but do not start any, peripheral players from these teams if you do not have to, because they are not implied for a lot of points. All of those teams under 18 points implied on the betting markets right now. So where the Sharps are betting to is also something that we want to factor in, because, Vegas over-unders are not always going to be right. We want to keep in mind where the Sharps are putting their money, because they obviously have a lot of information at their disposal. They know the trends of the sports books and where these lines should be. The Denver Broncos, Buffalo Bills, and Carolina Panthers games, respectively, are the only 3 games on the entire slate, and this slate has no bye weeks this week. We had 6 teams on bye last week, 0 teams on bye this week. Those 3 games are the only games actually catching steam on the over right now. The rest of the games, Commanders, Eagles, Pittsburgh Steelers, Jaguars, Dolphins, Patriots, Seahawks, Browns, Rams, and Cowboys, they're expecting to have lower over-under games, and the Sharps are taking the under in those ones, especially that Seahawks-Browns game, not looking very appetizing, already a low over-under to begin with, and we have the Sharps putting 97% of the money on the under, so definitely want to avoid that game. Maybe keep JSN on the bench, Elijah Moore on the bench, any fringe starters, Kareem Hunt potentially on the bench there as well, and then the Steelers-Jaguars game, already a low over-under at 42, not expected to be a very high-scoring game according to the Sharps there. Only 3 total games with Sharps on the over, as I mentioned. Definitely not a good situation, especially considering all 32 teams will be in action this week, so there's 16 games to choose from, and most of the games are catching steam on the under. So let's move on to some of the advanced data points. We definitely want to be looking at pace of play, because the more offensive plays that are ran by 2 teams combined, the more fantasy production we're usually going to see from those 2 teams. So with the Dolphins offense versus the Patriots offense, we're seeing the fastest paced game of the week at 28.07 time in between snaps. So that game could be expected to go a little bit more higher scoring. than we're initially anticipating there. We got the Steelers-Jaguars game, Colts-Saints, 49ers and Bengals, which is a game that I think will end up being a little higher scoring than people think. And then the Cowboys-Rams there as well. Those are some of the fastest paced games on the week. As far as some of the slowest paced games on the week, we're seeing this Giants-Jets game pop up again as a game that you probably want to avoid if you don't have to start any Giants wide receivers or, any non-Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall guys from the Jets. Probably don't do that. Then the Tennessee Titans and the Atlanta Falcons, again, another game not checking any boxes here for you. So you don't want to probably be starting a lot of, Tajay Spears or any fringe players in that game. Buffalo Bills and Tampa Bay Buccaneers, a little bit of a slower pace game. I actually have a bet on the under tonight. And then the Denver Broncos and Kansas City Chiefs, Commanders, and Eagles also expected to be slower pace games. So those pace of play stats, something to keep in mind when it comes to those fringe start-sit decisions that you guys might have. Offensive DVOA versus opponent's defensive DVOA is something that we can also glean some nuggets from here. So you guys can see the offensive DVOA is based on the far left team, and then the defensive DVOA is versus their Week 8 opponent. So some of the biggest advantages on the week, you guys can see the regular, offenses that are going to put up points in any given week. Of course, they're going to rank highly in offensive DVOA this season. The Dolphins, the Lions, the Ravens, we expect to do their thing. You want to be starting players from these teams if you can. They've all been good offenses the entire year. But I also wanted to highlight two other offenses that scored well here. The Chargers offense, as I already talked about, fire up, Austin Eckler and Keenan Allen, of course, but also Josh Palmer's a decent start. If you need to stream a tight end, I think Gerald Everett's a good option. Justin Herbert is a top 6 quarterback for me this week. So they are also an offense that you want to be firing up. It looks like they're in line to score some points against the Bears on Sunday Night Football. Of course, I have to play against Austin Eckler this week, which is not ideal. And then the Texans offense as well, sources of a solid fantasy play in those matchups as well. Nico Collins, of course, will be in your lineup. I think you could start, probably Dameon Pierce as of right now in the backfield. And then also good streaming opportunity for Dalton Schultz, for CJ Stroud, the quarterback, and also for Tank Dell, who should be back from his concussion. It looks like Robert Woods is going to be out for this game as well. So keep that in mind, too, that the CJ Stroud, Bryce Young Bowl is the battle of the first and second overall pick. And CJ Stroud, the guy who's played better so far of these two rookie quarterbacks, could have a why didn't you draft me type of moment against the Carolina Panthers. So CJ Stroud, one of my favorite streaming quarterbacks of the week, which I'll get into later on. Then we get into some of the biggest disadvantages. So this is the opposite side of the spectrum, right? We have bad offense going up against good defense as opposed to good offense going up against bad defense. So these are situations we really want to avoid if possible. The Giants, the Browns, and the Steelers, we kind of expect them to struggle on offense any given week. So it's no surprise here that they don't perform well. The Giants offense versus the Jets defense. I mean, only Saquon Barkley should be in your starting lineup for an example there. But also, I want to point your attention to the Rams and the Buccaneers, who typically, I would say, are okay offenses. Neither of them are like great offenses, but I will say that they're both in really tough matchups on the road against the Cowboys and the Bills tonight, respectively. So keep that in mind when you have like a fringe starting option like Chris Godwin, for example, or Rashad White. Maybe you want to lean in, towards a player with a better matchup, with a better game environment, because these guys are not in really good spots there. So now let's move on to the wide receiver cornerback matchups. And of course, when you guys are making wide receiver start-sit decisions, again, these should be used mainly as a tiebreaker. You don't want to be, outright sitting a really good receiver because he has a tough matchup and vice versa. So some of the tougher matchups on the week, you guys can see them on the screen there. The Giants wide receivers, as I mentioned, going up against the Jets corners, sit them all. Marquise Brown against the Ravens corners, probably want to sit him, although it is a revenge game for him there. Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton going up against Trent McDuffie and L'Jarius Sneed. Sutton can be in your lineup as a top 36 guy, but I would absolutely sit Jerry Jeudy. Then we have Michael Pittman Jr. versus Marshawn Lattimore, not listed as a shadow matchup, but he is expected to see a lot of Marshawn Lattimore, so maybe a good Josh Downs spot there, and also something you want to temper expectations for Michael Pittman. And then also we have the Browns wide receivers, Cooper and Elijah Moore, going up against Tariq Woolen and Devin Witherspoon, so not a great matchup for those guys as well. Probably want to leave Elijah Moore on your bench, as I mentioned. And then some of the yellow matchups, so these are a little bit more neutral, just keep that in mind. They're probably fine, but keep it in mind what we're looking at here. So Pickens, Deontay Johnson, Nico Collins, and CeeDee Lamb especially, probably in decent spots. Not a good matchup, not a bad matchup. And then the green matchups that we have here, these are advantageous matchups. So these are the guys that get upgraded on the week because they have good matchups. Terry McLaurin going up against the Eagles. He typically does really well against the Eagles, so he should be in your lineup. Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs, assuming they're both healthy, They could probably be good starts this week against the Vikings. Zay Flowers against the Cardinals cornerbacks. He should be in your lineup this week. Chris Olave against Daryl Baker. He is a very, very good bounce back candidate. So definitely go out and send some offers for him and make sure he's in your starting lineup. A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, they're going to do their thing against the Commanders secondary. And then DJ Moore going up against the Chargers corners, also in a pretty good spot, especially knowing that Tyson Bagent actually showed to be a functional quarterback last week against the Raiders, although this is a bit of a better defense, and it's in prime time that he's going up against them this week. So now let's get into the positional matchups. So I'm going to go through the top 5 quarterback matchups of the week, the bottom 5 quarterback matchups of the week, and vice versa for running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And then I'll also go over some streaming defenses and kickers for those of you guys that are sickos and still play in leagues with those positions. So the top 5 quarterback matchups and the bottom 5 quarterback matchups, you guys can see them both on the screen. Top 5 to my left, bottom 5 to my right. We have some great matchups for some great quarterbacks. I'm sure Jalen Hurts, Justin Herbert, and Lamar Jackson were in your lineups anyways, but very good to know knowing that they could absolutely crush this week, could absolutely smash. All of those guys have top 5 matchups across the board against fantasy quarterbacks. So RIP to you guys if you have to play against Jalen Hurts, Justin Herbert, or Lamar Jackson. Best streamers here look like Brock Purdy if he's cleared, because he is actually in the concussion protocol right now. Probably wouldn't mess around with Sam Darnold if Brock Purdy isn't cleared, but if Purdy plays, he should be a top streamer this week. And then Dak Prescott, also a pretty good streamer this week, may have been dropped in your league because he was on bye last week. Some deeper guys with some good matchups if those guys aren't available and you still need a streamer. As I talked about already, CJ Stroud, a really, really good option in a why didn't you pick me game against Carolina. And then Sam Howell, also a pretty good option. He performed really well against the Eagles last time they played. And also we know he kind of chucks the ball all over the yard, runs a little bit. So he's pretty much a pretty good start any given week. And then some of the bottom 5 quarterback matchups, make sure to leave Russell Wilson, Baker Mayfield, Josh Dobbs on the bench. Don't let them see the light of day in your lineup. And also make sure to temper expectations for Joe Burrow, who has a tough matchup, as well as Jared Goff, although both of those guys are still inside my top 10 quarterbacks, so I still think they're okay plays. Just a little bit of a sketchy matchup for those guys. So moving on to the running back position. So these are the top 5 running back matchups and the bottom 5 running back matchups. We have the Austin Eckler eruption game, very imminent. Again, I told you I'm playing against Austin Eckler. Make sure to buy low on him now because it looks like a really, really good spot for him against the Chicago Bears. He could absolutely go crazy for like 40 fantasy points and it wouldn't shock me. Isaiah Pacheco also in a really good spot for the Kansas City Chiefs. He's been dynamite these last couple weeks. Ramondre Stevenson, he performed really well last time they played the Dolphins way back in week 2, and it looks like he's also going to have another good matchup yet again. Gus Edwards and Alexander Mattison, also 2 running backs with good matchups. I suppose Justice Hill and Cam Akers would fit into that as well. But all of those guys are kind of matchup dependent RB3 flex plays. Hopefully with no teams on bye this week, you don't have to start those guys, but they do have pretty good matchups if you do have to start them. So some of the running backs with bad matchups, you guys can see them on the screen there. James Cook, Darrell Henderson, Jonathan Taylor, Javonte Williams, and Josh Jacobs, all with difficult matchups this week. All of these guys are still inside my top 26 running backs at the moment. But maybe just want to temper expectations for those guys because, for example, James Cook going up against the Buccaneers tonight might not end well for his overall fantasy performance. So if you have a better option, a wide receiver 2 type that you wanted to start over James Cook, I do think that is a viable move. Top 5 wide receiver matchups, I already kind of touched on it a little bit with the wide receiver cornerback stuff, but great starts this week for DJ Moore, for Drake London, who I didn't really touch on. He also has a really good matchup against the Titans. The Jags duo of Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk, and yes, I'm still trusting Calvin Ridley despite the 2 down performances the last couple weeks. And then A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, as I already touched on, have really good matchups this week. The fringe guys that I'd like to get into my lineup if you need a flex option and you're really desperate for whatever reason, you have a bunch of injuries or something, Rashee Rice is in a really good spot this week, as well as Zay Jones. If you guys are struggling with injuries, both of those guys are fringe starters that may even be able to be picked up on your waiver wire that you could throw right into your lineup as a pretty solid top 40 to top 50 wide receiver if you're desperate. Then when it comes to the wide receivers with difficult matchups, you guys can see them on the screen there. The Seahawks trio of DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and Jackson Smith-Njigba. Of course, Marquise Brown of the Arizona Cardinals. The Rams duo of Cooper Kupp and Nakua. Of course, those guys are still in your lineup, but they have a tough matchup. And then Cortland Sutton. Those guys, all temper expectations for them. They're probably still in your lineup regardless, but I probably don't want to start them if I don't have to. And then I would outright sit any Giants wide receivers, so Wan'Dale Robinson, Jalen Hyatt, whoever. Jackson Smith-Njigba I would probably leave on the bench as well, especially if DK Metcalf is back. Maybe Tyler Lockett as well because he hasn't really been very good this year. And any other Cardinals or Cowboys wide receiver you probably don't want to put out there as well. And then also Jerry Jeudy for the Denver Broncos. I know it says there that, against number 2 receivers, the Kansas City Chiefs are a little bit more favorable as opposed to against number 1 wide receivers. But alignment-wise, Cortland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy see a lot of the same type of corners. So, and also Judy's just been terrible so far, so I don't really want to play him. Now we get on to the tight end matchups. You guys can see them on the screen there. Travis Kelce and George Kittle both set up well this week. Make sure those guys are in your lineup. I'm sure they are. And then good streaming matchups for Jake Ferguson, for Logan Thomas, and Gerald Everett. So if you are in need of a tight end, maybe you have somebody that got injured, Freiermuth or somebody like that, Jake Ferguson, Logan Thomas, and Gerald Everett are really good streaming options, as well as Trey McBride potentially, who could be available on your waiver wire. Dalton Schultz was on my waiver wire, who I just picked up, as well as Dalton Kincaid, who was a big waiver wire pickup, and Michael Mayer. All of those guys are pretty good streaming options this week. If you have any specific questions, let me know in the comments. And then some of the bottom 5 tight end matchups, you guys can see Evan Ingram has a pretty tough matchup against the Steelers, but he is still in your lineup. I'm actually starting Dalton Kincaid tonight, despite the tough matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, because I'm encouraged by the usage, the fact that Dawson Knox is going over to IR. I already have Josh Allen, so I'm playing the stacking game there, and I traded away Kyle Pitts earlier today because I wanted to offload Kyle Pitts since having picked up Drake London in a trade yesterday. So I'm relying on Dalton Kincaid. I did pick up Dalton Schultz just in case Dalton Kincaid takes a couple weeks still, but I'm excited about Dalton Kincaid for the rest of the season. So make sure, even though he has a tough matchup this week, make sure that he is rostered in your league, and then leave any Seahawks, Colts, or Browns tight ends, including David Njoku, on your bench if you can handle it, because not really good matchups and not good in game environments there for those players. So moving on to the defenses, and then we can get out of here. Some of the best streaming defenses of the week: the Philadelphia Eagles defense, the New York Jets defense, the Detroit Lions defense, the Los Angeles Chargers defense against Tyson Bagent on Sunday night, and then the Seattle Seahawks defense are all good streaming options this week. My favorites would definitely be the Philadelphia Eagles and the New York Jets if you can get your hands on them, but they might be rostered in your league, so keep that in mind. When it comes to kickers, I mean, Younghoe Koo's got a good matchup, Jake Elliott, Vikings kicker, Chargers kicker, Dolphins kicker, those guys all in pretty good spots there. So if you guys have any specific start-sit questions, leave them down below in the comments. If you want our weekly start-sit rankings, as well as all of the data that was used in this video, so you can make your own start-sit decisions based on this Vegas information, based on these matchup charts and all that good stuff, that will be linked down below in the pinned comment. You can get access to it by going to Underdog Fantasy and depositing just $10 using the promo code FSE. Within 24 hours, you'll get an email with access to the weekly rankings, as well as our rest of season rankings. Or if you want our weekly rankings, rest of season rankings, dynasty rankings, all of our bonus content, I'm going to be writing up some college football stuff probably later on this weekend. Then make sure you are tuned in to flockfantasy.com. Use the promo code FSE for 30% off any of the packages, annual or monthly. If you sign up annually, you get 6 months for free, as well as a free Zoom consultation with myself or with Danny to talk whatever you want to talk about. And also you'll get all the bonus content from all of your favorite fantasy content creators like Mason Dodd and Zach and Badaka and all those other guys. We've all teamed up to bring you guys one great product, and we think it's pretty spectacular, and a lot of cool stuff coming in the works for Flock Fantasy. You're definitely going to want to make sure you sign up for that annual membership so that you are tuned in for all that we got going on. So with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.